It is the catchphrase so far of a presidency. Fake news, lies, spread as truths. What danger do they pose? Can they ever be stopped? You're watching Roundtable with me, David Foster. How can we know what we are reading, watching, hearing is the truth? What effect does fake news have on our lives? Can companies and governments be trusted to protect us from this new form of propaganda?
Fake news. Fake news. Fake news. Fake news.
The words are synonymous with US President Donald Trump. But far from just being a catchphrase, fake news is a reality of our daily online lives. Lies spread as truths, embedded in every part of our information network. Can fake news be deleted? Now known as fake news, it is essentially modern-day propaganda. In the world wars, propaganda was used by both sides to gain support for their war efforts. Germany used it in its campaign to persecute Jews, turning the German people against them. But propaganda didn't end with the war in 1945. The US and the Soviet Union engaged in a continuous political confrontation during the Cold War. Pro-American values were promoted through movies, music, literature, and art, while demonizing Soviet communism. Now, with the internet, fake news can spread around the world in seconds. Misinformation in stories from natural disasters to entertainment. But in politics, it goes further and deeper.
Many of the same techniques that we saw that the Nazis employed in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s are still being used today by propagandists of various political spectrums, particularly on the far right.
A recent MIT study showed fake news spreads 6 times faster than the truth on Twitter and is 70% more likely to be retweeted because people prefer novelty over truth. The Malaysian government is proposing an anti-fake news law, but the media fears it will be used against them. French President Emmanuel Macron is planning to introduce laws to fight fake news, and other European countries are considering action.
We are ready to stand against all this kind of fake stories or fake news.
World leaders are now pressuring tech companies to stop the spread of misinformation on social media. Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg has apologized for the platform's data leak and its role in the spread of fake news.
It's clear now that we didn't do enough to prevent these tools from being used for harm as well. And that goes for fake news, foreign interference in elections, and hate speech, as well as developers and data privacy.
The US senators were criticized for letting him off the hook. Can tech companies be trusted to monitor what's on their platforms? Will governments have to introduce tighter restrictions at a risk to free speech? Or is fake news a virus that can't be controlled?
And I'm very pleased to say that joining me at the round table, we have Andrew Kidd, a lawyer and treasurer at the Conservative think tank, the Society of Conservative Lawyers, Nicholas O'Shaughnessy, author of Politics and Propaganda Weapons of Mass Seduction. We have the journalist Georgina Godwin, considered an enemy of the state in her home country Zimbabwe after she challenged state-run media by launching the country's first independent radio station and was accused of spreading fake news. We'll get to Georgina on that in just a moment. And also the senior researcher at the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, Ewan Lawson. Welcome to each one of you. Nicholas, let me start, and then please jump in as much as you feel you can. Lies are halfway around the world before the truth has got its boots on. Mark Twain.
Mark Twain.
But why? Why does that happen?
I think, firstly, we shouldn't assume that people are naive or credulous. The aim of the fake news maker is to sow confusion and doubt. It's not to gain belief. This is really the whole point. People, too, have a private life. They don't have the time to read authoritative sources, and therefore they're very much dependent on what is immediately out there. And through that crack comes fake news.
See, what I'm wondering is why lies appear to be so much more believable than the truth.
Well, there is a scholarly academic study which of Facebook and social media, not the one you cited earlier, which says that actually there is no distinction between truth or fake news on Facebook, that they're both equally believed. In other words, there is no way of the truth getting the upper hand on social media. This is what the academics are telling us.
And yet MIT...
That must be right. I mean, Facebook is just a platform for information. It's
Exactly.
user-generated content.
Exactly.
It's not Facebook's responsibility to check the provenance of all this
It's
information.
not an encyclopedia.
Exactly.
Well,
So
except we are saying that it is Facebook's responsibility.
we're saying
now.
it should step up to the plate and take more responsibility, absolutely,
We'll get
and
to
quite
that.
right too.
We'll get to that a little bit later, if we can, about ways of stopping it and what should and shouldn't be done. But this MIT survey that was mentioned in our reporter piece there said that 6 times more likely to be believed if it's untrue.
Well, I think, David, it begs the question that why are audiences willing to believe it? What is the underlying issue that they are so desperate to believe these alternative facts, these alternative narratives? That throws open all sorts of questions about society.
Right, is that not in part a reflection of the fact that the public have lost confidence in some of those institutions, whether
Yes,
that's
this is
the media,
the whole point.
lawyers, journalists, politicians, and therefore, if your mate round the corner tells you something, that instantly has more belief to it than if it's said by one of those. And
Particularly if it's building on an existing prejudice.
Absolutely.
Lies have been around for
very
time
important.
immemorial.
Of course
This is not new, but it's a new platform.
And the vulnerability to conspiracy theories is the fascinating part of this, that people find reality very perplexing, very arbitrary, and something which unites all these phenomena with a coherent explanation, which is a conspiracy theory, has an intuitive appeal to people.
Let's ask Georgina about your experience in Zimbabwe, where you were accused, it probably wasn't meant, used the term fake news then, you were accused of spreading lies.
Oh, and propaganda. And what I was trying to do was counter the state propaganda, because the state had a broadcast monopoly. So we challenged that in the Supreme Court, and much to our surprise, won, which meant then we started an independent station, which the sole aim of that was to get information out to voters, this was just before an election, to tell them that there was another way. You didn't have to believe everything the government told you. And it was really interesting because this was pre-internet, pre-everybody having internet, pre-smartphone. And people really only had the information that the state could give them. And I guess you could classify that as fake news. Obviously, I believe what I was doing was trying just to tell the truth, but that can be spun in so many ways.
Did you get the sense that they were very frightened of what you were able to do?
Oh, absolutely. They're very, very frightened, because finally here was somebody, a group of us, not obviously just me alone, but people getting that message out that there was another way. You didn't have to believe vote Robert Mugabe and Robert Mugabe's done this or that. There were other alternatives out there.
This is the power of propaganda, whichever side you happen to be on, doesn't it?
Exactly, yes, yes. In other words, there's an important question of information control. There the state had a monopoly of information, but that's historically quite rare. If you take the Nazi example, the interesting thing about it is that they were competing with other information sources. You had foreign newspapers for sale in Berlin until the war began. You had foreign radio stations during the war. You had the BBC, which a lot of them listened to. So they had to make the propaganda sophisticated and plausible, and they did.
And your argument in your book, Selling Hitler, the Nazi propaganda brand, is that they were brilliant at it.
Well, they were...
They refined it in a way it had never been refined before.
Exactly. They had groups spread rumors, groups spread graffiti. But Goebbels' fundamental understanding, remember, he wasn't a propaganda dictator, he only had control of radio and film, was that the public are apolitical or anti-political. The real key to their propaganda was entertainment. They subordinated entertainment to propaganda. Glossy films, some of them color films, romances, dreamy vistas set in centuries past. This was actually the core of Goebbels' propaganda theory. You sugar the pill. So it's a much broader idea than fake news, although fake news was incredibly important to them. For example, the First World War began, Second World War, not with the invasion of Poland, but with a fake attack on the German radio station at Gleichwitz. And they created all these bodies in German army uniforms from concentration camps. They say, the Poles are attacking us. And Hitler then goes to the Reichstag and says, we will reply bomb for bomb.
What is the danger, Ewan, because you're from the Royal United Services Institute, what is the danger of what we're hearing about in times of particular tension? And we are living in difficult times at the moment.
Well, maybe the interesting thing at the moment, I mean, two partly related observations. You know, the first is that fake news is not propaganda. Fake news is just a tool of a propagandist. And propaganda doesn't always have to be negative. But what I think is particularly interesting at this particular time of tension is we are not seeing our potential adversaries in the UK, our competitors, sending positive messages about themselves. Instead, what they're doing is they're just seeking to confuse, to obfuscate, and to undermine confidence in the West. and you know, that is very much the risk. I mean, you know, the fact that you have a conversation going on about, I can't think what the phrase Corbyn used was, but you know, incontrovertible evidence. Well, what is incontrovertible evidence? You know, that we're finding ourselves pushed into a place where we're really not very comfortable.
And I think you're absolutely right, talking about it in the context of what's happening right now with the strikes on Syria, because I think what we're seeing now is that this war will be won, or certainly fought, through propaganda. The minute it happened, you had Britain rolling out the big guns, so to speak, Boris Johnson writing an op-ed, the Secretary for Defence writing an op-ed. It's all about how this is spun in the media and through the context and through the eyes of the people who want you to see it in a certain way. Of course, the Syrians are saying something different, the Russians something entirely different too. If you were one person reading all of this, you would be hard-pressed to figure out exactly what it is that's going on and who's doing it.
That's the difficulty, isn't it? Because people have to make a judgment call on the information that they're assessing. It's very difficult to do.
It's like, you talked about sort of so much out there. It's like the chaff that's thrown out of aeroplanes to confuse the missiles that are going. They don't know which the target is. There's so much of it there. How is it possible? You say check, 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 but people haven't got the time for that. And they don't know how to check either.
Well, I think it's time we educated ourselves. I think this has got far too serious for us to sit back and go, oh, well, I just consume anything that comes. When was it published? Who was it published by? Who are the sources? And what was the intent? What is this out there for? I mean, because you go all sorts of shades of grey, right from parody, which is, it's out there, it's funny, you're not meant to believe it, through to something that is absolutely designed to deceive, and in between all sorts of things in the middle.
And I think
it really
at
is up to us to check.
Yeah, at the end of the spectrum where it is so pernicious and so damaging, I think the law does need to catch up.
Well,
we've got defamation, there are rights of action out there that have been very long-standing, but the law has not caught up with fake news. And I think it's time, certainly in this jurisdiction in England, for an offence of hosting fake news. That could be one way of addressing it.
There's no code of conduct yet, isn't
Well, it's a relatively new phenomenon in its current characterisation.
Yeah. We're faced, you see, with the more general problem of the decline of authority, with a capital A, respect for authority. For example, there's the Syria Propaganda and Media Group with half a dozen professors from top universities as part of it, which is essentially a conduit of Assadist regime propaganda. But anyone who has a predisposition can turn to them and say, look, but this is what they're saying. So there is no one univocal voice anymore in the world. There are always people who can sound plausible with a completely different view.
Can I bring in something to do with that? Syria propaganda and media, you mentioned, was something I was going to bring up, but there's also something called the British Syrian Society. And I was showing this to Georgina before the programme. This was from the Times, you know, the voice of authority, if you like, 2 days ago. The former head of the SAS, Special Forces in Britain, is among 3 establishment figures who've become directors of an organisation accused of championing the brutal regime in Syria through the British Syrian Society. Now, there are 2 interesting bits in that as far as I'm concerned. One is, should they be allowed to do so? Why not? It's a free society. They should be able to say what they want. But how can I believe that story? So I don't know where to start sometimes. And you say check, 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 but there's so much misinformation out there, it's hard to know
So I do think, I think
What
one of the things is that government needs to be much more proactive than it currently is. I mean, government efforts in information strategy are pretty close to woeful in this country. I mean, it says something that the most impressive counter to Russian propaganda at the moment is coming out of the European Union, and their East group is genuinely endeavouring to challenge Russian propaganda.
So it's an idea, you think, that we might have another Ministry of Information?
If you want to configure it into that label, I mean, it's a bit like the word propaganda. Ministries of Information and propaganda all sounds terribly, terribly negative. But actually, someone has got to be there saying, that is a lie, or this is untrue. If it was published in a newspaper and was challenged, there'd be an apology and a withdrawal comment, the next day, possibly a very small piece of text in the way in the corner, but it would be there. There is no vehicle for doing that at the moment.
Well, I don't think it's necessarily the responsibility of government entirely, though, Ewan, because you've got organisations. The largest news organisation in the world now is Facebook, even though it says it's not a news platform. And Google and Facebook and the like are stepping up to the plate and creating checking
because they've been
mechanisms.
Told they have to.
Yes, so the government does have a role.
Somebody's twisted their arm, and the government
has a role in it. But it's not solely at the door of government.
But in World War II, we actually had something called the Anti-Lie Bureau inside the Ministry of Information, which sounds Orwellian, but it became Orwellian because some of the things it was in charge of debunking were actually true, and so it becomes a circular process of mirrors.
Whether it's governments or whoever, ministries or whatever, I mean, somebody has to check this. I'd be interested in this one. Mexico's got a presidential election coming up, and there's a group called Verificado 18. Yeah, we're checking, we're 18, we're adults. And some of the things they're checking, reports that one of the presidential candidates posed nude with a drag queen. The wife of another candidate is the granddaughter of a Nazi, and a third contender said he would go out and buy votes. Now, these are people who are concerned. The youth of today checking this. They do need some backup, don't they?
No, absolutely, absolutely. And although I love all of those stories.
You see, this is it. This is why lies spread faster than
the trouble, though, is that very sophisticated people, one's private friends, today spout absolute drivel. It's amazing the number of people who believe that 9/11 was created by Mossad or by the CIA, or that no Jew was killed on 9/11. And highly educated people will say these things to you, and it's difficult to know what to reply. In other words, there is a process of contamination.
Well, one of the things you write in this book, Nick, is that propositions too facile to be taken seriously creep surreptitiously beneath the mind's cognitive defences.
Exactly.
So you can say what you can be as outrageous as you like, but again, another thing, if it's repeated often enough, and if it's interesting enough, as Georgina was saying, you're going to take it in.
Well, Russia is saying we did the Syrian attack at Duma.
But I think that's absolutely. But I think that's the power in a way of social media, is the ability to just click on something means that things get spread much quickly. I mean, the number of people I've said, very interested that you were tweeting something from Russia today. Oh no, I wouldn't do that. No, yes, you did. Because you haven't looked at what the source was. You've just gone, click, oh, that's an interesting story, click, I'll share that with everyone. And that's how these things spread. Now, in some ways, that's a good thing. That's a powerful tool. But I do think there's got to be some way that when there is an egregious lie, and I'm afraid I do think the responsibility for calling out that lie frequently will lie with government, because we're talking about political issues primarily in this conversation. But somebody needs to say, that is a lie.
The difficulty is that they're trying to do this. We mentioned it in that report. They're trying to do this in Malaysia. They're making fake news illegal. But of course, those legitimate, in quotes, news sources, websites, say, hang on, this is an attack on free speech, because the same laws could be applied to us.
The European Commission is just in the middle of drafting a document saying that Facebook and all the other online platforms have to now be responsible to fight online disinformation themselves. They're going to give them a chance to do it, but they are saying, and if you don't, that's when the legislation will come in.
And Germany, I think, has called Google legally a communications company now. So it comes under its communications legislation.
Whereas previously it was?
It was a tech company. So they've explicitly bracketed it alongside newspapers and radio.
Okay, so some kind of legislation might be needed, but how effective could it be? Since we've had propaganda fake news, white lies, black lies, call them whatever you want, since time immemorial. How on earth can you stop them?
Well, it's a question, I think, of civic constraint. If you go back for 75 years, you look at the debate in the Ministry of Information, where junior minister Sir Harold Nicholson asked why the sinking of a great German battleship, I think it was the Scharnhorst, was not actually filmed by the British and retailed to the international media. And a senior civil servant said, well, that's terrible. You can't actually show a great ship sinking. That's immoral. And so you had those constraints, which we had to unlearn because of Hitler. And this is what Nicholson was on about. But that's gone. It's just become a brutal fight for public opinion throughout the world now, and we have to use new tools.
I wonder if there's something in the education system as well. I mean, I'm very struck, I teach at university as well, the lack of critical thinking on behalf of some of the students. You know, they just absorb things rather than saying, well, that's interesting, but what about, and what's this angle? And I just wonder whether we need to have a look at our education system and whether there's opportunities there for just getting people to think more critically about what they're reading.
I mean, that would be a wonderful idea, but what you're suggesting is that they've lost trust in you as the fount of all knowledge.
What actually happened in the US in the 1930s was the propaganda analysis movement, which provided toolkits for schools and universities. It's sort of 10 points of propaganda analysis, like glittering generalization. They had huge impact. The trouble is, in 1941, they were wound up, and they all had to go and join the American propaganda effort, rechristened information. And after the war, we didn't have propaganda. That was only the Russians. So the whole thing disappeared from the lexicon. And if you don't have a word for something, you don't see it.
I have a teenage daughter, and actually at her school, they are all taught to recognize fake news. I don't know if it works or not, but they certainly have lessons on it. And they're all taught to, you know, what to look for, which I think is fantastic.
I don't know. The whole programme on how you do spot it, because it's rather like trying to look for colour in a black and white world, isn't it?
And we're all professionals around this table. We're trained to know and to check the provenance of stories. So it's much more difficult for people that don't have the benefit of that training. Going back to the legal point, though, if we make these companies legally responsible for the content on their platforms, that is going to be a very powerful tool in making them check fake news and be compliant in this area. Because at the moment, newspapers are responsible for something that's defamatory. And at the moment, it's just falls into this black hole, and there's no legal culpability necessarily against these US providers. This is the question.
You told one of our producers that you don't think fake news will be effective forever.
No, I think what I was trying to say was that if you look at particular forms of the way fake news is done, so if you look at the theft of emails from the Democratic National Committee as part of the US election preparation, clearly had an impact on the campaign in some way. By the time you get to the French election, where there are emails stolen from Macron, very quickly the people around Macron come out and say, we've had our emails stolen. So be prepared for a flood of nonsense stories. And it didn't have the same impact. So I think some of those particular forms of fake news, the impact does diminish over time. But human beings are inherently skeptical people. And the more, I mean, part of the problem for Trump is every time he says fake news, people go, well, it's not fake news, it's just something you don't want everyone to know about.
Yeah, and one day he may say it's fake news, it is fake news, and nobody will believe it was crying wolf.
Similarly, this weekend, we've had similar stories coming out saying Russia may come back to us with fake stories, with
compromise.
Every time my internet went off yesterday, I thought it was the Russians. That's a conspiracy theory.
We have been warned.
Too far. I live in a small village. No, let's wrap it all up with the idea of will truth prevail?
Oh, well, I certainly hope so, and I think that true authority, if you're being authentic, it shines out, and I like to think that human nature will return to that again and again, and I think that you possibly agree that this is going to burn itself out, really, in a way.
In this form, I mean, I think as I say, we're seeing a particular form at the moment, which is particularly related to the internet and to social media. That form, I think, will change and ebb and flow, but that impact will be taken on by something else. But I think you're right. I mean, I think ultimately human beings seek for truth. And
they like the truth too,
like
don't
the
they?
truth.
Yeah.
I agree with Georgina. I think you've got to believe in human nature, seeking the truth. Ultimately, the law will catch up, society will catch up. At the moment, we're still playing catch up with a really new phenomena of this mass dissemination of information. We will get there. Will the truth prevail?
Well,
if you believe it will, what will it take?
I am optimistic that this is a battle we'll one day win. The more difficult one is where something is neither true nor false, but a mix, like the so-called Belgian atrocities of 1914 by the German army, which cast their shadow all over the 20th century, which were neither true nor false. There was a bit of truth in it, and that's the real problem. Dr. Goebbels, for example, hardly ever told a lie. He'd always have a little bit of truth amid the bodyguard of lies, and that is the real battle, not between truth and false.
And if he was absolute professional, what he did, are we seeing a lot of other professionals of the same mould out there now or not?
Well, there's no one his equal, thank God.
Okay, well listen, thank you very much. Thank you very much
Thank
indeed. We've quoted from Selling Hitler, Weapons of Mass Destruction. You've got a radio programme in which you talk about world affairs.
On Monocle 24.
Thank you very much indeed, all of you, for coming in. It's been fascinating. Whether we can get round to talking about the legislation that is necessary in a little while, we will have to wait and see. YouTube is where you can find all of our Roundtable programmes. This one will probably be there within 24 hours, or you can watch us live on your particular choice of television viewing. You have been watching Roundtable. I'm David Foster. That is The Truth. Hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.